Well, good evening. My name is Eve Bridberg. I'm the executive director here at GrubStreet. And on behalf of all of us at GrubStreet, welcome to this Writing for Change event. It's the latest in our series of tackling pressing issues of the day. We have done, we've talked about climate, reproductive justice, and AI in this series. And tonight we're really excited to talk about the state of our democracy. It really means so much that so many of you signed up for and came out for this on a Monday night. I think it's healthy for all of us to feel like we're in this together, so thank you so much for coming. Before we begin, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. GrubStreet's Center for Creative Writing is located in the city of Boston on traditional lands of the Massachusetts tribe, and we would like to pay our respect to the ancestral bloodline of the Massachusetts tribe and their descendants. Before we begin, I wanted to tell you a little bit about GrubStreet. For those of you who are new to us, welcome. We're a nonprofit creative writing center that offers hundreds of classes, events, and programs each year for writers of all ages and at every stage of development. We strive to remove barriers of access to the writing world, animated by the idea that everyone deserves the right to explore their imaginations and tell the stories they want to tell. Many of our programs are free. There are scholarships and fellowships available in almost everything we do. We run on memberships and donations from people who care about having this kind of powerful cultural asset in the city of Boston. So if you're interested in getting more involved, please visit our website at grubstreet.org. And if you want to stay in the loop, you can sign up for our newsletter. We're partnering tonight with Writers for Democratic Action, an all-volunteer network of more than 3,000 writers and readers and literary citizens from across the country and the world who believe that words matter. They use their voices to protect and strengthen democracy by hosting or co-hosting conversations like tonight's. Here in Massachusetts, the WDA Mass chapter formed after the 2024 election and includes more than 400 members statewide. The co-chairs, Jessica Keener and Randy Susan Myers, where are you? They're here tonight in the audience. Membership is free, and if you're interested, I believe they have flyers around. Is that right? On the back table? Okay. We're also delighted that a few pro-democracy groups are tabling with us tonight. John is here from the Coalition for Healthy Democracy. They're a Massachusetts-based nonprofit made up of civic leaders, educators, and reform advocates from across the political spectrum. They're leading the campaign to pass all party primaries through a ballot initiative in November 2026 in order to bring more competition, fairness, and accountability to our local elections. Andrew and Jess are here from Partners in Democracy, an organization founded by Danielle Allen, who's one of our panelists tonight, to pursue democracy renovation state by state, advancing people's right to vote, run for office, and see and shape their communities. The Massachusetts Action Team is focused on building pluralistic, supermajority coalitions to achieve democracy renovation here in the Commonwealth. Currently, they're focused on multiple ballot initiatives likely to go before voters in 2026. We invite you to visit their tables. They're tabling back in the cafe and to learn more about their work. So finally, tonight, we are here for a vital conversation about the state of our democracy, America's foundational documents, and the role that storytelling plays in shaping our nation's narrative and molding arguments for political reform. It's our hope that you'll leave tonight feeling more educated and empowered, and with practical ways, if you so choose, to get involved in efforts to fight for, write about, and strengthen our democratic systems. For this conversation, we're joined by two powerhouse authors and scholars, Jill Lepore and Danielle Allen. Jill Lepore, yes, nice round of applause. Jill Lepore is the David Woods Kemper Professor of American History at Harvard University and a professor of law at Harvard Law School. She's also a staff writer for The New Yorker. A two-time Pulitzer Prize finalist, her many books include the international bestseller, These Truths, A History of the United States, which I can't recommend enough. She lives in Cambridge, Mass. Her latest book is entitled We the People, A History of the U.S. Constitution. Danielle Allen is the James Bryant Conant university professor at Harvard University. She is also the director of the Allen Lab for Democracy Renovation at the Harvard Kennedy School and the director of the Democratic Knowledge Project Learn, a research lab focused on civic education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. The author of many acclaimed books, her latest is titled Justice by Means of Democracy. I love that title. Their conversation will be moderated by Rishi Reddi, one of our oldest GrubStreet instructors, one of the originals. And Rishi is an attorney based in Cambridge, working in the areas of climate policy and environmental justice. She's also a beautiful writer. Her short story collection, Karma and Other Stories, was a PEN New England Award winner, and her novel, Passage West, I highly, highly recommend as well. She sits on the board of the National Book Critics Circle and serves on the steering committee of the Massachusetts chapter of Writers for Democratic Action. I do want to mention that all of these authors will be signing books later. The bookstore will stay open till a little bit later than usual so that you can purchase copies, and I recommend that you do that and read their work. And with that, I will hand things over to you, Rish.
Thank you so much, Eve. And thank you so much, GrubStreet, for hosting this event. It is a great privilege to be in conversation with Jill and Danielle about this topic at this moment in our country's history. I have 6 or 7 questions to start off the discussion, and then we'll open it up to the floor. I'll be sure to hold about 30 minutes, so you guys will have a generous amount of time to ask your own questions to our panel. And then, as Eve said, we'll do a book signing at the end. So I just want to say, mark this, that we are, in the United States, the longest running modern democracy, the longest running continuous democracy in modern times. We should have great pride in that. But I also want to share this quote from John Adams, which may capture the anxiety of many of us in this room right now. Remember, democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There never was a democracy yet that did not commit suicide. So right now, we are seeing so many of our democratic institutions being abused, dismantled, and ignored. The usual checks on the executive branch through the judiciary and the legislative branches have fizzled. We see attacks on the rule of law, attacks on a free and open press, which inhibits our avenue to accurate information, and we see attacks on free and fair elections. For those of us who care deeply about democracy, these transgressions and the cruelty behind them seem overwhelming. We feel helpless and sometimes paralyzed. So, Danielle, I want to start off with you, given that context of where we are. With your deep study of democracy and its systems, can you please tell us what the hell is happening here?
Oh, God.
What is your diagnosis of the health of our democracy? Are we about to be admitted to the emergency room? Are we on life support? Please elucidate some of what's happening.
Well, first of all, just thank you, Rishi, for being the moderator for this conversation, and to GrubStreet for hosting. And I'm very excited to learn about Writers for Democratic Action, so I hope we'll get to hear more about what you're up to. Would love to understand that. So thank you for your engagement. It's an important conversation. I'm also really glad to be here with Jill, who's a good friend and colleague. In terms of diagnosis, the first thing to say is that the project of freedom is hard. And it also can be hard to hang on to the knowledge about what institutions you need to protect freedom. And I say that sort of abstractly by way of preface because in the 18th century, when the challenge of George III was the overwhelming and anxiety-inducing event, people were very clear, both here in the colonies and in England, that what would be required for freedom was what people called legislative supremacy. Okay? the idea that a legislature representing the people would channel the many different conflicting points of view of the people and steer through a sort of synthetic, messy kind of process, but nonetheless steer the direction of the society. And that legislature would do that having achieved independence from an executive. In other words, the goal was to put the executive in a box so the executive would take direction from the legislature. And the idea was, this is how people have freedom, because this is how you protect yourself from being subject to the sort of arbitrary will of a single domineering individual. And literally both the colonies and Britain were tackling this issue at the same time. In the colonies, we chose a revolution in order to get that legislature set up for us that was going to channel the will of the people. In Britain, they spent 50 years or so trying to tackle the corruption of an overreaching monarch and reforming their institutions in order to try to rein that monarch in. So here we are, fast forward 250 years later, and compare King Charles to Donald Trump. And ask yourself, who restrained the executive? So we don't have legislative supremacy in the US at this point. We have been losing it for most of the 20th century. And in the last less than a year, that loss has been sort of hypertrophying. It's on steroids as we watch the Trump administration and President Trump himself drive forward a maximalist vision of unitary executive. So in short, no, we have lost the thing. I would say we've already lost the thing that we were trying to have. And so for me, the question is, how do we get it back? How do we achieve legislative supremacy? Lots of folks talk about, we have sort of no kings rallies. And I like to say, if you want no kings, then the job is to save Congress. And that's really what we should be talking about.
Thank you.
You started off so upbeat. I thought this was going to be it's not as bad as we think. We have such strengths of our civil society. You're like, no, we've lost. That's true. Okay, I'm just going to agree with that. But I don't know that I've ever heard you be so down where we're at.
I mean, I'm not down in the sense I think there's something we can do about it. Like, I think we can win back our freedom. I think we can win back legislative supremacy, and that's what I spend all of my time doing. But the first step of winning that back is actually trying to recover for ourselves the desire for freedom.
Well, I'm just going to point out, because I know this is a session about storytelling, what brilliant storytelling that we just sort of witnessed. The framing of that problem, right? The kind of Donald Trump, King Charles, get us from the 18th century is a really fantastic illustration of the clarity of a kind of narrative that probably is a way I've not really heard people talk about our current dilemma in exactly that way. And I felt like in the room there was a lot of like wide-eyed, oh. So we're just throwing that out for the storytellers here.
That's great, though, because we can't help it. If you ask any of these people to say anything, they're going to tell a story. So that is like right up our alley. Okay. But Jill, let me just ask you, you started with King George, of course, Danielle, but in the interim between, in the 1800s, was there this type of the same historical tensions that you've written about before? The racial hierarchy, the ejection of immigrants, the denial of women's rights, policies that exacerbate and exploit the class divide, even a conversation around the fairness of the electoral college. Are we just seeing more of the same? I think Danielle has said what we've lost already in terms of legislative supremacy is different than the past. But where are we and is this a way to talk about it? Where are we on the scale of like, oh, we've surmounted these types of difficulties before, we can do it again?
Yeah, so I came to see, in 2018, I published this book called These Truths, which is a history of the United States, like a long book, like a 1,000-page book. And people are like, well, how is it so long? I'm like, actually, because most of what you read is 140 characters, and some things just actually require depth of study. And there was a way to partly, like writing a long book was about insisting this actually requires sitting down multiple evenings in a row and reading to try to get your head around this long history and try to answer in your own mind these questions. But what would happen at public events, which were always just fantastic, like I had great audience, going on talking to great audiences, like really renews your faith in the American people to do book events, right? Because book readers are so fantastically interesting and curious and committed. And but by the end of every evening, and I would say this, I'd be like texting my husband, I guarantee it's going to happen again tonight. There would be 3 questions that would come every evening, and they would be, has it ever been this bad? So this is 2018, right? It's not this moment. You know, your question, has it ever been this bad? Who can we blame? And can you save us? Can you save us? And
You just took 2 of my questions.
I'm sorry. It really is just like, that's what, like, and it wasn't about me, right? It was like, I think anybody that came to town wandered through town on their horse and got off, pulled up their saddlebags and went into the town library, someone was going to say, has it ever been this bad? Who can we blame? And can you save us? It just felt like that was what everybody wanted and needed to know. So got to a point where I would say it kind of before we go to the queue, I'd do my lecture or whatever. And then before I was like, all right, here's the thing. You can't ask these 3 questions or I'll give you my answers now, but like we have to move beyond. So my experience this year, so whatever, 7 years later, what I could report from the trenches is that the who can we blame piece has actually sort of fallen out, which seems to me a really good sign, because what I would say, annoyingly, every time someone asked that was, you can blame yourself, right? Like it begins with your responsibility for like, in what way have you contributed to the decline of our civil society by failing to engage in stuff, by spending your time on your phone, by, not going to the city council meeting with us about revising the city charter, or, whatever, like the things that you just didn't do, or the ways in which you said something snippy to somebody at, the bake sale on election day. Like just really begins with you. Like there's not really someone else to blame. And I think that, I don't know, I feel like that kind of has changed in this sort of interesting way. I mean, talking to really like progressives mainly, who are the kinds of people who are going to show up to a book event for me, that people are like, yeah, actually we're actually contributing to this stuff. Like there's a different sense of the need for self-reflection, which I think is healthy. Has it ever been this bad, or are we in an unprecedented moment? I used to think that one of the reasons to study history is that it was always worse in the past. I was like, you weren't going to survive childbirth, or if you did, your child was going to die. And that's sort of like my measure of like, was it worse? Yes, it was worse. Like politically, we could think about all these measures, but I'm like, I'm sorry, but there's not a day when human bondage was legal in this country that isn't a worse day than any day today. Like they're just like, by so many metrics, like it's a crazy question to ask. Like, has it ever been this bad? Yes, it's been this bad. It's been a lot worse. That's sort of like the narcissism of the present, that we think it's uniquely bad. On the other hand, I did have the experience on January 6th, 2021, sitting on a couch like this with one of my kids, a high school student, in his civics class. He was required to watch the Electoral College certification for like high school civics. And I was like, dude, this is going to be so boring. What are we going to have for snacks? And like, we had like made this whole thing of like, we made popcorn. I was like trying to make this interesting. I made like milkshakes for us. And I was like grading papers. And then the fuck, like, this is interesting. It's horrible. And he was like, Mama, I don't even understand. I was like, I don't understand. But I remember like getting the flood of like emails and phone calls and texts, like, well, has this ever happened before? What's going on? What does history tell us about this moment? And I was like, fuck all. Do you know what I mean? Like nothing. This was like, that is not a precedented event in American history. Like you need to look to the history of other countries to understand an armed insurrection to defeat a legitimate election and seize power. And I really had this moment trying to talk to my kid about it. Like, we have really left American history behind in this moment. Like we are outside of any trajectory in which you think about the nation's story, whatever your beliefs or myths or political commitments or historical commitments. We're just outside of what is in any way familiar. And I do think it's important to note that. And for me, I love the idea that sort of what we've lost is legislative supremacy, but I think we're living in it, particularly now, and there have been ages like this before, of insurrectionary politics. And I think it's very difficult to defeat insurrectionary politics because the tendency is to become insurrectionary. And that political style is part of the perpetuation of the problem. So that's where I feel like there's something interesting around people having become reflective about the degree to which incitement on the left can be dangerous as well, and is not necessarily a form of organizing.
Would you classify, say, Gavin Newsom's seeking to redistrict California as a response, and sort of his comments on social media in the same, is that a sort of insurrectionary response to a time of insurrection, the way you just said, Jill?
Well, I mean, I don't know what Gavin Newsom says on social media, but I mean, that is an institutional response. You may disagree with it or you may agree with it, but he's not burning down the house. I don't know. How would you?
Well, no, I wouldn't call it insurrectionary, but what I would say about it is we are trapped. We're sort of locked in a trap of a highly polarized adversarial politics, some of which then becomes insurrectionary. We have sort of both the institutional version of it and the insurrectionary version of it. And fundamentally, that's the trap we have to get out of, actually. And so to watch sort of Texas and California sort of tighten the trap is extremely painful. So how do you actually think about that? I mean, the good news in this country is that we are, an incredibly elaborate structure, 50 countries, each of which actually has control over the federal structure. We sort of forget that the states own the federal structure. Our election laws at the state level determine how the whole federal system operates, actually. And so although you've got two states kind of doubling down on exactly the thing that we're trapped in, a set of other states are trying to work their way out of it. So we mentioned at the beginning of this, the all-party primary ballot initiative that we're working on here in Massachusetts. Oklahoma has folks working on that. Oregon has folks working on that. And this is an initiative that gets rid of party primaries and requires politicians always to run to the whole electorate. They have to build 50% coalitions. And by definition, that change of the incentive structure means you can't get sort of captured by extremist contingents that with small turnouts in gerrymandered, partisan primaries can control the whole institutional apparatus of the country. So in other words, the point is that playing the adversarial game is understandable and necessary. I mean, it's just sort of a fact of the politics at the moment. And the good news about it is that because we have this complex, multi-piece system, we can actually work on de-escalating even while some corners are still escalating. Did that make any sense? I know I'm getting quite abstract. In other words, yes, escalation is happening, it's problematic, but it doesn't have to be the whole story. And that's where we really do have something quite lucky in our federal structure.
Okay, let me ask this question about, we're in a time where we're seeing that a lot of old notions that we thought were sidelined are becoming mainstream again. And they are quite incendiary. A rhetoric that America was once a homogenous nation and that we should return to an idealistic past. And you can see how this is being reworked into the narrative of the country. We're redoing museums. We're revamping education. We're seeing extensive book bans. So could you both comment on that a little bit, please? Is that a true, I mean, I think I know the answer, but I'm just going to ask a question. Is it a true or false narrative about the homogeneity of America in the past? And why is it being done? Like, how is it being utilized right now?
So can I jump in first on that, Jill, and then I'll try to be short because I know you have a lot to say. So I want to challenge one premise
Yeah.
of your question, which is that this is being mainstreamed. I don't think that's accurate. We certainly are in the middle of culture wars, but there is a whole heck of a lot of survey data, for example, that a supermajority of Americans, more than 70%, want an honest history that tells us the bad as well as the good. So in other words, we are for sure watching contestation of our major cultural institutions. The fight over universities is that kind of contestation. The fight over the Smithsonian, the fight over textbooks and so forth. But it's a contest. It's not mainstreaming. And so I think it's really important to recognize that sort of where opinion of the American public doesn't necessarily line up with what the most kind of incendiary, contested moments are that we're watching. So I think there's a conversation to be had for sure about the structure of the contest. I think what propositions are being put on the table, what alternative accounts of history and so forth, and how should we think about that contest. But I would not say that we were at the point where these things were in fact being mainstreamed.
Yeah, I agree with that. I do, it is easy to point to, and we all have examples in our mind of ideological excesses of both the left and the right in this regard with the culture wars. So an example would be, or a pair of examples, I've been revising my U.S. history, These Truths, for a second edition of the college textbook edition. And I was told by my editor, you use the expression Gulf of Mexico, and your book won't be adopted in Texas or Florida unless you refer to it as the Gulf of America. And I said, okay, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm happy to explain in the section about 2025, this was a proposal put forward by the Trump administration, this renaming, but I'm not going to pretend that in 1590, when they dubbed it the Gulf of Mexico, it was the Gulf of America. But at the same time, I have a friend who a few years ago was working on a U.S. history textbook, and her editor insisted that she should not refer to people as poor. They had to be referred to as structurally disadvantaged by capitalism. So we can think, we can all think of these examples, right, where there's these weird ideological battles going on among people with extreme positions and as in a posture of zealous advocacy. But if you look at, for instance, the research conducted by More in Common, which is a fantastic research organization that I would really recommend to people, that does public opinion research in a very sophisticated way, that establishes that just the vast majority, 70 to 80% of Americans agree about most things. So if there is such a thing as a mainstream, it is well documented by More in Common's research, and none of those people would find comfort in either the idea that you can't call people poor, or that you must, you must obey what the president's latest, fetish is about some naming convention in his mind. So I do think it's important to recognize that the textbook wars, stuff like these, go back to the very beginnings of the history of textbooks, like that particular thing, or the museum conflict happens to be, we're in a kind of pitched moment right now, partly because of the 250th and partly because of the federal government's, particular interests. But we were in a pitched moment in 2020, after the 1619 Project came out. And we were in a pitched moment in 2008 when the Tea Party insisted that the academic understanding of the American Revolution was an error. There are just moments in American history, and the American Revolution is the chief one that Americans steer their political ship by. And so there's just a lot of buffeting in the wind when that thing is out in the wide ocean.
Well, then, if that's the case, that is very comforting to hear, I have to say, to have you both say that these things that are grabbing so much of headline space are actually, in terms of popular opinion, not that remarkable. So I would say to the both of you, what are some narratives that are waving around in the U.S. right now that you feel are the most destructive? Would you identify any? What are some of the stories that we're telling?
I've got one.
Okay.
Mine is very, very simple. But I'm glad you asked that question because I've been wanting to share this with somebody. I haven't said this out loud previously, but it's been driving me crazy. And it is that the conversation that we're having about immigration, I don't know how well people have registered this. The administration and its representatives will say over and over again, we are deporting criminal illegals or whatever, or criminal aliens and so forth. And they'll get pushed on that, right? Like, oh, you know, you just deported a student, or, you know, you just deported a kid, you know, criminals. And their defense for that is that anybody who illegally crossed the border counts as a criminal. And I don't know that people have actually registered that this is what has happened with their language. It's why they are so consistently using the vocabulary of deporting criminal X or Y or whatever the noun is. And the reason this is a big deal is because they, they claim, they're making a truth claim, and a kind of comprehensive truth claim about sort of like millions of criminal illegals in their vocabulary, which is not an accurate claim about people who have actually committed crimes for which they have been charged and the like. And so they have, because of that linguistic usage, taught the entire country to think that there are many more people with criminal backgrounds as we conventionally understand the word in this country than is actually the case. And I can see that changing people's thinking, changing people's decision and the like. And I think that at the end of the day, you know, borders need to be controlled for sure. At the same time, freedom is a powerful attraction. And if you are a free society, if you're going to preserve freedom, you will always have people wishing to join you. And so immigration to some extent, to some real extent, is a necessary part of having a free society. And so it seems to be just incredibly important, actually, to be able to say that somebody who has entered illegally, you know, sort of doesn't carry the criminal label, even at the same time that you are ready to express a desire to defend borders. So at any rate, that's not exactly a kind of deep history myth, but it's been a kind of little language trick that the administration is very self-consciously deploying, and I think it's having a huge impact. So it concerns me greatly.
Yeah, I don't know that I have a single sort of national myth to call particular attention to. There's a lot of little things I would talk about, but
I have to say that the immigration piece, I was amazed at how quickly the shift happened. You know, that little piece of calling everybody who crossed without documentation illegals, and then to push that off into criminality, and how quickly, you know, it changes. It changes everybody's outlook and the effectiveness of that language. It's brilliant. You know, this is the horrible thing about it. Jill, I got to ask you about Article 5 and the Constitution, and what you feel like, are there narratives and storytelling pieces around how we think about amending the Constitution, the fact that Article 5 exists, that people have thought, yes, no, I'm going to keep, it's not coming in that. Okay. That we'll always be amending the Constitution, but that we're in this moment in time right now where we really are not, it's not something that we have looked at for a while. Could you comment on that a little bit?
Yeah. So I argue in this book that the United States constitutional system was founded on what I call a philosophy of amendment, which was, you know, a way to resist, to inoculate a new government against tyranny, the inevitability of tyranny, the suicide of democracy, the inevitable exercise of arbitrary power on the part of an executive, legislative overreach, judicial overreach. Was, you know, there are many strategies. One is to have a mixed constitution with checks and balances and a kind of, you know, minutely, exquisitely engineered constitutional system. Another was to write it down, so that it couldn't be abused, so that people couldn't sort of pretend that what they were doing was constitutional, because you couldn't challenge them. You couldn't show like chapter and verse. But the problem with writing down a constitution was then how would you change it? And so Americans, really, this came from Massachusetts and the people of Massachusetts objecting to the first draft of the Massachusetts Constitution for its failure to provide people with a mechanism to amend their own constitution. The towns of Massachusetts just turned it down. They said, just write another one. We need to have a convention, and we need to have an amendment mechanism for the people. And that then was imported into the U.S. Constitution, written in Philadelphia in 1787. And this idea that you could repair, correct, improve, adjust, modernize, make amends, that the ability to change a written constitution is just elemental to our system of government. And it just turned out federally that it didn't work very well for a lot of complicated reasons. It's always been difficult, and there have been long stretches of American history where it's been effectively impossible. You know, the 12th Amendment was 1803, the 13th Amendment was 1865, because Americans, the main thing they needed to amend was slavery, and they couldn't agree on it. So that's a long stretch of time. We are in a long stretch of time where the Constitution hasn't been amended, hasn't been meaningfully amended since 1971. And it creates all kinds of structural knock-on effects. It creates a sense of powerlessness on the part of the people, who I think most Americans don't know that the Constitution can be amended. And why should they? We don't talk about it. We don't propose amendments. We don't deliberate over amendments. We don't have state constitutional conventions anymore. I mean, people do, of course, ratify their amend their state constitutions often, but the practice is atrophied, and our sense of ourselves as a people, as the authors of our own Constitution, has evanesced. And I think that is a factor in contributing to an insurrectionary politics, because the whole point of Article 5, which is the amendment provision of the federal Constitution, was that if you're going to write down a Constitution and there isn't an amendment provision, the only way to fundamentally change the government, not your governors, but the frame of government, the structure of government, would be by revolution. And that's what the framers did not want. So they put in this peaceful provision, like essentially a peaceful revolution for modifying the frame of government, in order to prevent what they feared, which was everlasting insurrection. And when in American history the amendment provision has become inoperable for whatever reason, currently it's inoperable because of polarization, it does leave people without options, and it can really contribute to the rise of a strongman, right? Because if things that you think need to happen in your government aren't happening, and Congress isn't functioning, and you couldn't get an amendment through, you can't get a basic law through Congress, you can't get a budget through Congress, it just contributes to people's feeling like there needs to be a way for change to happen. And a strongman is a way for change to happen. So there are all kinds of dangers to the failure to function, or our inability to exercise this power. So that's how I understand it. And the way this book operates is to say one way to help us see clearly what an amendment provision means and its availability or unavailability means is to understand that when the people can't amend the Constitution, the Supreme Court has far more power than it was meant to have over the meaning of the Constitution. And ultimately in our era, so does the executive, because we're living in an era where what is constitutional at this point is what the president says is constitutional, until someone else, like you and whose army, is going to stop him from saying birthright citizenship is not in the Constitution. Like we're looking we're in this very, day by day moment. What's the Supreme Court going to do about that one? But until the Supreme Court does something about it, where are we? Why are we not able to say birthright citizenship is there in an amendment that was popularly ratified?
Is there something around, the story about that we are looking in this moment to originalist intent, in this way, like as if it's a sacrosanct document, rather than one that was meant to be revised continually, to document a meeting of the minds right now? Is there something about that that's being used in particular, Jill?
Yeah, I mean, there's a long history behind competing theories of constitutional interpretation, and they have different political valences and affiliations at different moments. Originalism as we know it today doesn't get that label until the 1980s. It doesn't become kind of known in the public mind until the 1980s, really not until Robert Bork's nomination of the Supreme Court in 1987. It doesn't assume the power that it has on the court until quite a bit later than that. But originalism has a long and complicated history, and it is, in most points in American history, in tension, like deference to the original intention of the framers is in tension with the philosophy of amendment. They are reconcilable. You can both, like obviously reading an old document, you want to know who wrote it, who did they write it for, what did the words mean at the time? Like the basic questions that originalists ask are all very good beginning questions. But as a matter of interpreting the Constitution, or as a matter of doing history, they have real limitations. So I just think it's important to make legible and render visible to the public that originalism itself is not original, is not mandated by the Constitution. It's a theory that I think is subject to constant contestation.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I always love to point out that the Declaration of Independence, if you really want to be an originalist, listen to the Declaration of Independence, which tells us precisely that, if government is not securing our rights, this is in the second sentence of the Declaration, right? It's the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and institute new government. So in other words, actual originalism is about recognizing that you always need to evaluate how well the government is doing and alter it as necessary.
Danielle, you talk in your writing about political equality and how it's buttressed by economic justice and social policy. Could you just speak a little bit about that and how that can counter some of the negative narratives that we're seeing right now?
Sure. No, thank you for that question. So there's a long sort of story behind that question about the history of philosophy and what philosophy has put on the table for democratic citizens as kind of what defines your experience as a citizen. And one of those sort of long debates is about, do we care mostly about what people call negative liberties, meaning freedom from interference, so freedom of expression and conscience and religion and things like that? Or do we also care about positive liberties, the right to vote, to run for office, to help steer your own community at all levels? And so I'm a huge advocate for the idea that you need both packages of rights. And so that's what it really means to think about political equality. And at the end of the day, that's a set of commitments that I come by, first of all, just as a matter of kind of family inheritance. I like to share that my granddad helped found one of the first NAACP chapters in Northern Florida in the 40s, where lynchings were on the rise, speaking about how things have been worse, right? Like I have my granddad in my mind all the time. I mean, like lynchings were literally on the rise, and he put his life at risk in order to fight for the right to vote. Or my great-grandparents who fought for women's right to vote. My great-granddad marched with suffragettes on Boston Common in 1917, which was a year when Woodrow Wilson had the military in D.C. to suppress protests of suffragists and was throwing women in prison who were being treated abominably, going on hunger strikes as a result, and then being really horribly force-fed and the like. So again, another kind of context where, things have been bad in the past as well. But in both of those cases, the importance of that story is that they chose that path to empowerment over protection just of their kind of basic material interests. This is a sort of life choice that many people have made. The African-American traditional political thought has for centuries sort of put a premium on the idea that empowerment is the bedrock for human thriving and well-being. But there have been sort of lots of sort of work of philosophers and policymakers that have disregarded that view and have thought that what people want fundamentally is just material well-being. We don't need to care about people's dignity, people's empowerment, as long as there's a certain amount of redistribution operating and the like. But that's just plain not true. Sort of human beings, their drive for dignity, their drive for empowerment is a part of the story of how they thrive. And so we need a politics that recognizes that. And that's what political equality is fundamentally about. And so to bring this together with economic policy to give you a sense of how that matters and how this sort of theoretical point matters for the problems of our toxic politics currently, let me just share a story. Actually, you know what? The story might involve you. I tell the story all the time, but I think it does involve you. So this is a story about the day after the 2016 election, when I was on what I like to call a Noah's Ark panel, where there's a historian, an economist, a philosopher. You were the historian, weren't you?
I was the historian.
You were the historian, and I was the philosopher. And we will leave our economist friend unnamed. But at the before the panel, I was talking to our economist colleague, who said to me, Danielle, you know, we economists, we always knew globalization was going to take 20, 30 years to work its way through the world's economic system. But it wasn't until I've been watching this election that I finally realized that I had never once stopped to think about what that kind of change feels like in the life of a person in a place being transformed. All right? So that's policymaking that does not pay any attention to the question of whether or not people are empowered to contribute to decisions about how we're steering the ship, or doesn't take into account the question of can people, even contribute to the question of if we're going to go through a time of transition and transformation, how should we go through that? I mean, what are the things that would actually make a difference for people living through that? So that's, for me, where you can do economic policy in a very different way, in a way that both from process and from the sort of goals of the policy are making sure to bring people's basic experiences and perspective into the decision making. Same thing's true with social policy of various kinds. And so the right approach to policy making, from my point of view, improves the legitimacy of political decision making, improves trust in institutions, and is a way of avoiding the kind of problems of resentment and alienation and toxicity that we currently are experiencing. It's so funny that I literally tell that story about that panel all the time. Anyway, so that's
it makes
nice
me want to go home and Google who could have been the economist.
Yeah, well, I won't tell you where.
That's the first thing I do when I go home.
No, it wasn't that colleague. I will give you that much.
No, I can see why you would think that, though.
No, it wasn't that.
Let's just say it was that colleague, and then you don't have to go Google it.
It's true. That would be easier.
All right, let me. What time are we at? Let me hit you guys with one more quote, and then another question, and then we'll go to the audience. So, this one's attributed to Winston Churchill. Democracy is the worst form of government, except all those other forms that we've tried from time to time. So, and to the point that you both made earlier, a Kettering Foundation Gallup survey found that 2/3 of Americans agree that democracy is the best form of government and agree on the vast majority of basic values. So assuming that's true, what do we do now? What can the regular individual do to win back and strengthen our democracy? We voted. We thought that's what we were supposed to do, but clearly, Jill, we're screwing it up. You said that we are to blame. So what can we do? Now, what would you advise us?
I actually think people need to get involved with their local communities more actively and be involved in more face-to-face community building activities. I actually think that the nationalization of all political questions is a problem for human beings. We can't actually make a decision about what books should be in our kids' elementary school library with reference to who is in the White House. And that's really damaging to how people relate to one another in communities. I think we live in families and in neighborhoods and in villages and in towns and in cities. And it's really a big act of imagination to belong to a state and think of yourself as a person from Massachusetts. But if everything that you have to think about by way of how you behave in the world is related to which national political party you're in, and you lead your life receiving information that is directed at you on the basis of your political preferences, there is just actually no way out of the kind of trap that Danielle talked about earlier, that you're just essentially walling yourself brick by brick in a room, and it's very lonely in there. And so I really think people need to make a deep commitment to unplug themselves not just from social media, honestly, but I meet so many people who have questions for me about something they learned on MSNBC, and I'm just like, what's going on in your neighborhood? I just don't. I know that people want to be part of some like national struggle to defeat Trumpism and MAGAism. That can't happen until we create better lives for our own communities. So that's and I think that involves writers as well, and thinking about. We haven't talked about reporting, the importance of investigative reporting, the importance of local news coverage. There are a lot of things that writers can be involved in. Public media, strengthening the accountability of the media. I think those things are all really important. I think, watching MSNBC and being on TikTok that's when I say, who can we blame? And I say it's us. That's what I mean. I don't mean how you voted. I mean, what are you doing with your time when you think you're being involved in politics?
And I would second that. I do have a multi-part answer in contrast to Jill, but the first part of my answer is the same as Jill's. So I take it that there are really three things we need to do: heal our civic culture, reclaim our institutions for responsive government where legislatures are effective and are supreme, and then thirdly, also reorganize our policymaking processes so that they are democracy supportive as opposed to democracy eroding as they currently are. But the story about civic culture is exactly the story that Jill just told. It is about forming community in our local context. It's about joining groups. Sometimes when people ask me that, the what should we do question, which is I also get everywhere I go, I just say, join a group. You guys have joined a group already, so that's good. All right, so that means we need step number 2. All right, so here's step number 2. Okay, so I'll go on to step number 2. So at any rate, we do need a vital, vigorous local civic culture. We do also need to claim our civic roles, our civic identities. And again, at the local level, and recognize that at the local level that we own this entire edifice of our federal structure. So I spent a lot of time talking to people about the kinds of reforms that we can actually get done at the state level that would give us a different functioning federal government. The 2 areas to focus on are election systems and campaign finance law. We can change both of those things at the state level, and they would transform our politics. So back again to the all-party primary. You can go visit with Jesse and Andrew downstairs to talk about that. And here in Massachusetts, we feel like our politics are better here. In truth, we are not a beacon for healthy democracy. We have the fewest contested elections of any state in the country. 50% of our elections in the last decade had only one candidate in them. That means we're not actually debating the issues that matter to people. And if you don't debate the issues that matter to people, then you can't actually develop a sound approach to them. We also have the most restrictive rules for candidate ballot access in the country. So we are not an open democracy. We're a very closed democracy in Massachusetts. And those things, the fact that it isn't choice on the ballot, people's votes don't matter, then relate to the fact that we have actually below the national average voter registration for communities of color of all categories in the Commonwealth: Asian Americans, Hispanic, African Americans, as well as lower turnout. So we're not even an inclusive democracy in Massachusetts, despite what we tell ourselves. So an election system that's actually competitive. The all-party primary is one where you walk into the ballot box and you get a ballot, and for every race, you have all the candidates from all the parties available to you to choose from. So it doesn't matter if you're a Dem or an R or unenrolled, you get all the choices for every race. So every election's competitive, your vote always matters, candidates have to actually win 50% coalitions. That means they have to be coalition builders and not just dividers. And this will affect our federal politics because the candidates who are elected on this kind of mechanism, which is used already in 5 states around the country, have more degrees of freedom in their decision-making in Congress. They're able to make deals across party lines in the ways that people who are elected out of low turnout party primaries are not able to, because those people are just afraid of being primaried by the activist base, and that keeps them locked in a kind of ideologically fixed position. That's what has given us our polarized Congress. So that local change at our state level can actually unlock the polarization problem at the federal level. And then campaign finance, too. I mean, a number of states, Maine and Minnesota in particular, have passed some great measures recently that take about 85% of corporate money out of politics. And so that's, a way, again, you can unlock the kind of capture of a lot of our institutions by making progress at the state level. So I will spare you the third category about how we can change how policymakers approach their work, and just invite you to focus on your local community, as Jill said. Join more groups or get more active with the groups that you're already a part of. And here in Massachusetts, do learn about the all-party primary ballot initiative.
Thank you so much. That is a storehouse of information. Very valuable. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to folks in the crowd. Do you want to? Okay. Eve, why don't you take this?
Because that's plugged in. I need to be free, Rishi.
Okay. You can share.
Exactly. Well, sometimes we pretend we're our colleagues here.
Hi, thank you so much for such an invigorating talk. But, I don't see the problem with American democracy as being a structural one or institutional one. In other words, I don't see the problem with losing our legislative mandate. I think there are many problems with being ruled by the masses. I feel that the problem is that we've somehow lost the ability to deal with substantive democratic values. And that's the value of equality. So even as to your suggestion that we should all participate, we should all get involved, we should all vote, but if we don't value the democratic equality value, all of that isn't going to bring us to a happy society. And so I'm just wondering how we managed to have lost that substantive democratic value of equality that was so prevalent during the civil rights era, during the 70s, 80s, and now it seems to have gone by the wayside.
So shall I start, and then do you want to jump in? I thank you for your question, and I hear your concern and your sort of experience of loss in your question. I suppose I want to bring you good news, which is I don't actually think that that's an accurate account of where we are as an American people. And Jill cited opinion survey research. I like to cite ballot initiative results. So if you look at states around the country, it is astonishing how often the American people deliver supermajorities in favor of things where the values beneath them are equality, inclusion, sticking up for the person getting the short end of the stick. It's like in Mississippi, more than 70% of the voters voted to remove the icons of the Confederacy from their state flag and to replace them with inclusive icons. In Florida, a supermajority voted to restore voting rights to people who had completed service of their felony convictions. You can go on across the board and around the country. So the important point about all this is the reason we have to think about culture and institutions both. We are actually literally trapped. The American people is trapped by a dysfunctional federal election system. All right, that gives us choices that don't actually represent the center of gravity, opinion, and value set of the American people. And so we are constantly sort of forced to choose a value set that's been choices that have been actually produced by literally, sorry, this is getting tangled up. If you look at Congress and the folks who are elected from our gerrymandered districts and low turnout primaries, they've essentially all been elected by 5 to 8% of the electorate in that district. Okay? So in other words, our choices are over and over again coming from an extreme set. And the supermajority that the American people sort of manifests itself as over and over again in state level ballot initiatives cannot communicate its way through our federal institution.
Yeah. I'll come here and then I'll come to you.
Hi, again, thank you so much for this. It's been great to listen to your exposition. I'm from Brazil, and as people here might know, there's been some unfortunate parallels between politics here, politics in Brazil. We had our own January 6th. We had a president that also tried to, perpetrate a coup d'etat. The difference is that that president is now in prison. There's been updates every day, but last I heard, he was still in prison. I think one of the key differences from Brazil, and there's plenty, was we can call it independence of the Supreme Court in Brazil, that has been called by many people an overreach. In other words, one could argue that we preserved our democracy by having anti-democratic responses from the Supreme Court. And then we're talking about the United States being gridlocked in a system that is prompting incendiary resolutions from each side, and then that the response from the left, from a right-wing position or government that is not working, is to go to the other extreme and try to do the same thing, but from the progressive side. And I wanted to hear your thoughts on this. And I understand we're talking about like the importance of local government, of local action, but whether you think this will be enough in the short term, or whether the United States could be driving towards something like we have in Latin America, where you have basically one drifting from one extremist position to another, and in this case, needing perhaps an extremist position in order to save a functioning democracy and make sure that a democratically elected president actually took power and was able to govern.
Yeah, that is a really hard and really important question, and I honestly don't have an answer. I think there's real reason to worry about that, right? I mean, I think that I think many people were really concerned about, for instance, the attempt to prosecute Donald Trump. And knowing, I think, anyone who spent a minute thinking about it understood that that would backfire on the Democrats electorally. That it would unless it succeeded and unless the prosecution happened swiftly and unambiguously, Democrats would be punished for that electorally, which led Biden's Justice Department under Merrick Garland to drag its feet and do nothing, right? It was the specter of a kind of Latin American future that led, I think, insofar as I understand it, Garland to say, let's just not do it. Let's not do it now. Like, that's, once you start that tit for tat, and I think there were people who will say that was what was behind the Supreme Court's presidential immunity decision. They didn't want Trump to throw Biden in jail. Like, that's what they were actually trying to do, was think about how to protect the presidency from vindictive prosecution post administration. And I think that's a defensible claim. I don't happen to believe that, but I think that's a reasonable claim. On the other hand, I remember thinking when the first of the 4 prosecutions began, or the first of the 4 cases began. Well, the first one was the New York Stormy Daniels case, which was a dubious situation to begin with. But I remember thinking, it doesn't matter whether the Democrats will be punished electorally. This man incited an insurrection against the Constitution and violated his oath of office. Like, there needs to be a prosecution, even if it destroys the country. Like at some point, you actually have to do it. But I don't think that's an easy decision for anyone. And I think the outcome that a lot of people feared is exactly where we are now. Is the answer to continue on that path? I'm sorry, I don't, like, historians are useless on these predictive questions. So I turn to the political.
Well, and then anyway, and we unfortunately are a little bit, we can repeat ourselves. So the challenge is presidentialism, right? So that's what the U.S. and Latin America and South America share as presidential systems. We do now live in the U.S. in a system of just whiplash back and forth because we are being governed by executive order. And that experience of, anybody feel it? You guys feel the whiplash? You feel it? You feel it? That's what unfreedom feels like. That is what it is. So when I talk about legislative supremacy, it is about avoiding that whiplash. Okay? So that's exactly the story. We're already there. Doesn't look exactly the same way as it looks in Latin and South America, but that's why, from my point of view, it is so important to save Congress.
Hi, I've always had a question about political parties. Other than raising money, what is their use and why can't we just get rid of them? And I'm serious, I'm not kidding around. I'm an independent. I would like to be able to vote for who I think is the best candidate, but I would never, the way things stand now, I would never or rarely vote for a Republican. What if there weren't Democrats and Republicans?
Okay, no, thank you. That's a great question. And so let me say something about the difference between what we have in Boston and lots of other municipal elections in Massachusetts, namely a nonpartisan primary and an all-party primary, because that will be a way of answering your question. So in the Boston mayor's race, for example, when people run, they don't have party labels after their names, right? Whereas in the ballot initiative I'm describing, people would still have party labels, but you'd have your R's, your D's, your Greens, your Working Families Party sort of all on the same ballot. So why would one choose that as opposed to choosing the nonpartisan approach? There are two reasons. Voters need information when they go to the voting booth, and those party affiliations are a way of letting you know what that candidate is committing to. And that actually makes it easier to hold people accountable once they're in office. Have they done the things that they are committed to? So parties have that role that political scientists call the mediating organizations. And what they mediate in the first instance is information. It's actually very, very hard, especially in a mass democracy such as ours, for people to access the information that they need. And so parties are a structure for providing that. So that's sort of thing one. And then thing two is that actually the states that have the highest voter participation, highest turnout and so forth, they have that because there are organizations that are getting people turning out. And those organizations are mostly parties. And they do that when they face competitive elections. So parties are also mediating of participation directly. So the short answer is, I don't really think you can run a mass democracy without parties. But what you want is healthy parties. Right now, we do not have healthy parties. We have sick parties. And so what you need is actual incentives for your parties that will lead them into productive behavior. And so that's where putting them back on a playing field where they have to win votes, they have to actually earn votes, because right now, it's kind of a crazy situation where parties have declining enrollments, just like most Americans would agree with you right now. They are not members of parties. The majority of Americans are not members of a party. But even though enrollments are declining, taxpayers, we pay for party primaries. Okay, so that's like a business with declining customer base that still has a guaranteed revenue stream. All right, so that's the problem. So we got to take that away from them. No more guaranteed revenue stream. Like, you earn your people, okay? You go out there, do your work, you make the case, you have debates, do the actual thinking of considering our policy and so forth, and try to convince us to join you. And you'll know if you have or not through the election mechanism at the ballot box. That's sort of healthy incentive structure for parties.
There's a question up here. There's a question back there.
Thank you so much for your insight thus far. I've scrapped my first 3 questions as well because they were addressed at the start. But I do have one question for each, if that is all right. First, for Ms. Lepore, when thinking about community building, how do we address echo chambers, or echo chambers? I'm also from Brazil, so I have a bit of an accent. And segregation of community when it comes to lack of diversity and perspectives. The second question for Ms. Allen is, and I guess this is a question for the audience as well, how do we measure the impact of storytelling, such as the one that we've experienced tonight? For example, if we can figure out that 70% of people believe in an honest history, that means that at best 30% success rate of a narrative to combat that, whatever the counterfactual was, could be less than 30%. So I'm curious, what are the mechanisms for us to measure the impact of storytelling, such as these wonderful books and the conversations that we're having tonight? And if they don't exist yet, why?
I want to answer the question about echo chambers, not eco chambers, because I'm like, let's talk about ecosystems and ecological governance. I will answer my question, and then you can also answer it as well, whatever you want. Yeah. I would say maybe this answers both questions to some degree. I think there's never not a good time to celebrate where all of these things are in fact happening, and that is in public education. That is in K-12 classrooms, in public schools here in Boston and across the state and across the country, where the very work of building community, engaging with people who are different than you are, learning from them, learning how to learn from people who are different from you, learning what it is to have things in common and also have differences. That is a huge amount of the work that public education does in this country. And yet the profession of teaching in public schools is demeaned, reviled, attacked, humiliated, underpaid, underfunded. We don't, for instance, at the institution where we teach, we do not train people to be public school teachers. That is a thing that the Ivy League once did send mainly young men, but out in to be, at least the men were high school teachers, but there was a deep commitment to public education as a career of distinction, whose prestige was measured in its importance to our civic community. So all the things that we are calling for here in terms of restoring civic health, that's work that's being done every day by people that are dragging themselves out of bed at 5 a.m. to get to a school by 5:30, 6 o'clock to get a classroom set up with materials that they're paying for out of their own pocket for a crap salary to deal with kids who have all kinds of problems. And we do not even celebrate that. So I just want to say, like, if you want to be part of a solution, volunteer at your local public school. Find ways to support your neighborhood public school, your city public school. Think about what that work is. I remember going into, just thinking about this immigration question, I remember going into my kids' kindergarten in our neighborhood school in Cambridge and just stumbling in, spending maybe a little more time in the room than I normally did when I was like rushing off to get to class or get to office hours or whatever. And the kids were all like sitting in these rows, and I was like, what's going on here? They were doing a unit they had been doing for weeks, and I had just not even noticed it, where they had made a big map of the world on the wall, and every kid had put a pin in for where their family came from around the world. And it could be any member of their family, where they were born, where their parents were born, their grandparents. And of course, the whole globe was populated. And they were sitting in rows because it was a day they were getting on an airplane, because they had made passports for themselves. And every week they went to a different country. And the families of those kids would come in for that week. And if it was Korea, they would bring in Korean food, and they would learn Korean dances, and they would watch a Korean TV show. And, they would get on the airplane and they would go to Korea for the week, and they would learn about Korea because there was, a little girl in the class whose family had come from Korea or whatever. Then they would do Haiti the next week. And I was like, this is the American fucking dream in this classroom. And it's not part of how we even think about our city. Like, where are the grown-ups doing this work in this country, right? Like, so I just kind of want to put my own pin on the map and be like, where's that stuff happening? Where can you help that stuff happen? It is in a classroom in a neighborhood that you live in.
Yeah, I just go second that.
I want to thank you both, all three of you, because despite your best efforts, I'm taking a very positive message away from this evening. And that message is, and perhaps my synthesis is all wrong, that message is that through the Constitution, we have the opportunity to remake the federal government through the mechanism of the state legislatures, and that it's our privilege and duty to work on improving those state legislatures. And now comes the question. So you have talked about, I keep thinking they're called the across-the-board ballots, but what are they called?
All-party primary.
Excuse me.
I like
across-the-board
ballots.
How does that fit in with ranked choice, or do you think ranked choice is hopeless for non-numeric Americans?
Well, thank you. That was a great summary. I appreciate it. I'm a huge fan of ranked choice voting. I live in Cambridge. We're both Cambridge public school parents, and we're both ranked choice voting voters. So that's a thing you can know. Oh, great.
Me too.
Awesome. Thing to know about us. And I just want to second everything Jill said about teachers. When people have asked me how to solve some of the kind of narrative problems and how we tell our history, I always, the teachers are solving those problems every single day. So no, I am a huge fan of ranked choice voting, and I actually think that it's actually pretty easy to use. People get comfortable with it pretty easily. At the same time, sometimes you have to sort of make change incrementally. And so the all-party primary is, in some sense, a first step. If you really wanted to wave a magic wand and get straight to sort of like the best kind of change, you would, instead of you have your all-party primary right now, it would be like Boston mayor's race. The top 2 candidates would go forward to the general. That's what's on the ballot initiative. Alaska has a version where the top 4 candidates go forward, and then they use ranked choice voting in the general election. And that does mean you get more voices moving forward. You get more diversity of debate in the public sphere. Those are all very positive things. Here in Massachusetts, the Attorney General ruled a few years ago that for these changes at the ballot, you could only do one step at a time, and the all-party primary piece is the necessary first step.
I think we have time for just one more question. And these women have been very patient back here.
Thank you very much. I want to reiterate for being here with us. I've really enjoyed this discussion. I wanted to ask about the sort of language we've been using to describe the health of democracies, and even that word health, I think, is metaphorical. We've talked about sickness and democracies dying, and that really striking quote about democracies committing suicide at the beginning, which seems to suggest that, like human beings, once it dies, it doesn't come back. I wanted to ask about what you think about that sort of metaphor, if we're sort of analyzing it closely. Are democracies something that once you lose it, it's gone, or is it possible to kind of revive and reconstitute? And if we were going to think about sort of the worst case scenario, that we kind of lose the American democracy, whatever that is, that we have now, is there a version where we come back to some sort of democratic form, maybe not exactly in the way we exist now, but a sort of reincarnation? Is that possible?
Okay, France is on Republic number what? 6? So, what is, I don't remember. Somebody knows what Republic number France is on, but 5th. Thank you. So France has had 4 deaths and 4 rebirths. So I think that gives us a kind of sense of possibility. I think it's also worth, and Jill may want to expand on this, recognizing that this country has had its own, near-death experiences. I mean, the Civil War was certainly a near-death experience, so might call it a death experience followed by a rebirth. You could make the case that the extension and entrenchment of Jim Crow, which disenfranchised such a significant portion of the country, was its own kind of death experience for the country. I mean, remember that after the Civil War, there was this period of incredible integration through Reconstruction and the like, which was then all unwound. So at any rate, I think there are ways to see death and rebirth, both in our own history as well as in comparisons.
Yeah, I think it is a great question. I also just love the subtlety of demanding that we think harder about the metaphors we're using. So thank you for that. This is a very writerly question. I guess I would say 2 things. One, really, it's not until 1965 with the Voting Rights Act and the Immigration Act that the United States really begins in earnest its experiment in being a multiracial democracy. These have been bumpy decades, and all things considered, you're not doing that bad. I actually think there's been tremendous extension of political and economic opportunity across those decades that we could think about and celebrate. So maybe there is a case to be made that if we don't measure the current state of affairs against all of American history, and we look back and recognize that those were very different kinds of polities before 1965 that were wrestling with different problems. Maybe that's a way to have a little more grace about the challenges of this moment. But I do think it's true, and you could correct me, maybe I'm wrong about this, but I recall reading that while there's quite a literature on the growth of democracy and the inculcation of democratic behaviors, and there's quite a literature on democratic backsliding, right, the kind of decline and decay of democracies, there isn't really a great political science literature on the restoration of democracy after backsliding. And I wish there were. I mean, that we could talk about France, but like that there actually just isn't a great political science body of knowledge about how do you do that? How do you rebuild that? Is it like an amputated limb, then you can have a prosthesis? Like, could you regrow the limb? Like, what metaphors could we use to think about that? I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that the answer is for us to devise.
One tiny footnote on that, because there's a little bit of work. It's true, it's not as big as the other areas, but looking at the case of India, actually the case of Poland, and one of the consistent aspects of the story of the regrowth, and Jill sort of alluded to this, is forming cross-ideological alliances and partnerships. So back to connecting outside of your own bubble.
I think, I know there are more questions. I'm sorry that we don't have time to get to all the questions. We want to make sure that we have a little bit of time for book signing and mingling. So I want to invite you all. We're going to start picking up chairs, but we're going to create tables so so our guests can sign books. And we invite you to stay and connect with one another. And we really encourage you to buy these books and get them signed. And I hope you'll all join me in thanking Rishi for your wonderful moderation, and Jill and Danielle for inspiring us.